Welcome to the Emerging Scholar Podcast, Season 1. We hope you enjoy this series of great conversations with leading medical researchers that's designed for graduate students, medical trainees, residents, and fellows to help you on your journey towards your first scientific project. Welcome, everyone, to episode 11 of the Emerging Scholar Podcast. Today, we have the privilege of having a discussion with Dr. Maria Mayan, who is one of Canada's leaders in qualitative methods and qualitative inquiry. When I asked around about who I should interview to introduce me to the concepts around how to do a qualitative study, Maria was the resounding lead in terms of who can describe this the best and who is currently doing this in the best way. This interview came on the heels of her recent textbook that she released in 2023 called the Essentials of Qualitative Inquiry. In this first episode, we talk about what is qualitative inquiry, how do we do qualitative inquiry, and what distinguishes a good qualitative method from a not so good qualitative method. Dr. Mayan is a community-based researcher with decades of experience as a qualitative methodologist. Her community-based research interests are in the area of partnerships and knowledge translation, and how citizens, community organizations, clinicians, governments, and universities can work together to address disparities and improve health outcomes. This was a fascinating dive into qualitative methods with some great examples delivered by Dr. Mayan. I hope that this also inspires you to open the door to try to consider qualitative methods in your own research journey. Okay, welcome everyone. Today we're going to be talking about qualitative research methods, and I am very grateful to have Dr. Maria Mayan here with us. I'll ask you to introduce yourself. You're at the University of Alberta, and maybe give us some insight into what drew you to qualitative methods and why is this a passion of yours?
Right. Thanks, Don. Good day, everyone. I was on qualitative inquiry because I did my PhD in the early 90s. So if anybody complains about doing a qualitative project now in 2023, I say, can you imagine what it was like doing my dissertation? It was qualitative. It wasn't mixed methods in the early 90s. And I was interested in policy, and I was interested in provincial government. And we, at the time in Alberta, had a premier named Rolf Klein, who was reconsidering government, restructuring government, slashing government. Government really had no role in citizens' lives was kind of his mantra. And I was concerned about this because nurses were being cut, social workers were being cut, teachers were being cut. And I was just really intrigued about how the civil service was experiencing this. How do you get through your day? And so I went and interviewed bureaucrats within this really drastic setting to say, tell me, we have all of these policies, but tell me how that works for you. How do you get up and how do you get through the day? So when people talk about what does qualitative inquiry do for you and what it might do for your listeners is really understanding how people make it through their day. What happens? How does life unfold for you? Tell me about how you through your day. Be my teacher, help me understand. And so I started that in the early 90s and never left. I had a great experience as my first job out of my PhD being in the International Institute for Qualitative Methodology, which still exists. And so I got to meet really great thinkers, great scholars in the area and learn from them. And then, of course, started teaching and then have just stayed with it just because of it. It's funny to say you love it, but I do love, I do love qualitative inquiry.
And I love that statement that be my teacher.
Yeah.
Which I think is one of the big differences between quantitative and qualitative. So that's a beautiful way to introduce this topic. And so for people that maybe aren't familiar or maybe they've just heard the concept, can you just define for us what qualitative inquiry is? And I'll use inquiry, not methods, but qualitative inquiry. And how is it different from the quantitative approach that people are maybe more familiar with?
Right. Yeah. So I could get myself into trouble right away by trying to define it because there is a divide, just like good scholarship everywhere. There is a divide really between more practice disciplines and more theoretical disciplines like sociology. So given that, really it is trying to understand how people make it through their day. It really is trying to understand life as it unfolds. It's social. And so, we might get into kind of epistemology, ontology, but qualitative inquiry was really not considered legitimate because we were using the rules of quantitative inquiry, physical science, natural science, and applying it to the social, right? So there's, one of my favorite people is Michael Agar. He was an ethnographer, and he talked about, it's just so perfect. He's right so well. Qualitative work is different than dropping balls off the Leaning Tower of Pisa and measuring that, right? Like, how does Galileo, how measuring that is very different than a patient who is struggling to decide, or a parent struggling to decide what they should do for their child. You don't measure that. You don't measure that in the same way as dropping balls off the Leaning Tower of Pisa. You can. I mean, I would never want people to think quantitative is better than qualitative or qualitative is better than quantitative, but that's really not a space you should ever get into. It's ridiculous. But it's the social world. It's how we're socialized. It's how we understand and perceive life. And we all differ that way. We all, through our experiences, through our culture, through everything that we filter through our heads on a daily basis, we all perceive reality differently. There's certainly themes amongst us about how we get through the day or how we experience something, but it's that subjectivity. It's understanding how people perceive something and tapping into that and going, oh, okay, I get it now, because you've been my teacher and helped me understand. I get how you perceive this. It's very different from how I perceive, or oh yeah, I get it. That's the same way I understand this as well. So really remembering it's social, it's the social world you're trying to, it's not the physical world. It's not that measurement that we can do. It's the social. So what are the methods you need to use to tap into that?
Well, no, I think that was perfect. I think the social, if we were going to go back to Ralph Klein, we could say, Ralph says we just saved $1 billion this year.
That's right.
And guess what? The percentage of people who've left their jobs is really low. So take a look at that data. And that tells you right now that what I'm doing is the right thing. But we all know that life is complex and that the experience of families in the healthcare system do not reflect what Ralph just stated quantitatively, or the exploration that you did into people who are still on the front line and now having to work through all of these cuts and trying to keep the system afloat, right?
Right. And actually, I love that you said complexity, because, people, again, the critique of qualitative is, oh, you have such small samples, you can't generalize. We can go there. But it's because of that complexity, right? It's because of that. We don't try and control A, B, and C. We invite that complexity. We say, bring it on. Bring on all of the variables, right? Bring on all of the context. You've got this, you've got that, you've got A, you've got B, you've got, what happened 20 years ago and what's happening, what you see for future. Okay, tell me about that. So we don't try and clean. It's not clean. We invite all that context. So when you invite all that context, you have a smaller sample. It's just too much data. And you find those themes, you find those things that will tell a picture or put the picture together in a smaller sample, just because you have so much data.
And to think that we can just capture all the complexity of life with one dimension of information is not going to get. Everyone gets it that life is complex. We're all complex. There's no one universal rule for all of us. So why would we not lean into qualitative inquiry as another way of enhancing our knowledge about the way life is?
And I think, sorry, John,
go for it.
I think anytime so people go, I won't do qualitative inquiry. I don't do qualitative inquiry. But as soon as you're in an interaction, it could be with your partner, a friend, and you ask them a how or a why question, you're thinking that way. So in practice, as soon as you go, I wonder why they made that decision. I wonder how they decided that. You're asking those questions. So, there's kind of this hesitancy to go, ooh, I don't think I'm going to go there. But as soon as you have those questions, you're thinking like a qualitative researcher.
Mm-hmm. I think that's how a lot of humans think.
Yeah.
So I think that's,
of course,
that this is just a natural, I think we're drawn to narratives. We're drawn to storytelling. it's something we've evolved towards. So I think we should also be drawn into this method of inquiries. So for the trainee thinking about jumping into this, in your book, you talk about the armchair approach and walking through certain steps. So the first part of this armchair approach is picking an epistemology, ontology, or picking a philosophy. So can you define what epistemology, ontology are, and then why it's important to start with your philosophy? And am I correct in saying you start with your philosophy before your question, or do you start with a general question and see which epistemology, if that's the right term, fits for that question?
No, I think the point of, depending on where you start, is it's got to be cohesive. It's all got to hang together. It's good research design. But we generally start with our research question, right? We generally start with an intriguing clinical problem, something that's bothering us, whether it's keeping us up at night. You're kind of going, I wonder why that parent, or I wonder why that child, or what could we do to make it better for these patients? What could we do to make something better?
So can I just interrupt there? So what, for you as an expert in the field, what makes a really good qualitative question? What you talked about before, it comes from society, or it comes from, let's say, an experience? But what makes it a really intriguing or a really insightful question?
I think it's grounded in a problem that we all research wants to solve a problem. I think a good question allows for the unanticipated to come up, for the oh my, I would have never seen that train coming down the track, right? It's pointed enough to kind of give you a bit of a frame to make you feel comfortable to go into your inquiry, but it's broad enough to go, man, oh man, I never anticipated that. So I think that's what makes a good qualitative question. And if you're more on the participatory end of things, like more of a participatory research, which can be qual and quant, but more on that patient-oriented or community-oriented, where the question should kind of come from the population, like, what do you want me to work with? How should we walk alongside this issue together? So I think those questions are also incredibly meaningful when a patient or a community, somebody says, this is something we've been struggling with, or can you help us work through this from a research perspective? So I think those make really good questions.
So then you start with this great question, and then what is ontology, what is epistemology, and then how would you create the starting point for this, what you call, I think, methodological coherence?
Yeah, so methodological coherence is, like I said, it's good research design. It's about making sure when you choose a particular orientation, when you choose a particular methodology, you're following that methodology. And there's a lot of crappy qualitative research published, but people think all qualitative inquiry is an interview transcript, you code and you categorize, or you code and theme. There's a big deal between categories and themes, but anyway, you code and then that's it. And then they'll put a label to it. They'll say, oh, I'm doing a phenomenological study, or I'm doing a grounded theory, because they read something somewhere and that just seemed like the thing to do. Each of these methods or methodologies have huge traditions, 100-year embedded in anthropology or embedded in clinical sciences, and have theories that are all underpin these methodologies. So if you say grounded theory, which is in the health sciences quite a bit, man, you got to go back for sure to 1967, when that grounded theory, meaning the only way we can really develop theory, or a good way to develop theory, is from the bottom up, is to hear from the people's experiences and then build concepts and connections among those concepts from hearing from people. That's the way a theory will actually match people's experiences if you go from the ground up. Well, in this 1967, that was heresy. It was, who are these Glazer and Strauss writing this? So when you choose a particular approach, methodology, you have to understand what it's supposed to do for you and how you have to move using that approach. And so that cohesion or coherence is, I'm choosing a grounded theory. A grounded theory is about process. We use a grounded theory because we're interested in a process. How do patients make decisions about this? And you think there's a not step one, step two, step three, but you think, people move through an experience this way. So I'm interested in the phases of how they have made a decision. It's the how. It is the how question. How did you get through this experience? Right away, I can tell if you're going to do a grounded theory, I can look at your question and I can figure, is that a grounded theory question? Because it's going to be about a process. And in grounded theory, there's lots of different ways to collect data, but your analytic technique is completely different, than all other methodologies. So there is an analytic approach that fits with grounded theory. So if you're doing a grounded theory, you better be doing the analytic approach that matches that. And then the outcome is kind of a mid-range theory. That's what you're going to get. So when we talk about the armchair walkthrough, and I've been told by my younger students, it's not really appropriate anymore. In my day, you'd sit in the armchair and go, okay, if I want to ask this question, what method can I use, or methodology, and I know I'm using that interchangeably, what methodology can I use that will answer that question? How can I collect data? Will people be available? Will those people even answer my questions? Can I use art? Can I use story? Can I use film? What kind of data sources will answer that question? Then the analytic technique. Okay, that makes sense. And then the outcome. Okay, a theory. Is that what I really want to do? Do I really want to develop a theory? Maybe I don't. Maybe that's not actually what I want to go into. So, okay, let's try something else here. And so it's sitting in your armchair, sitting wherever you're comfortable, and thinking through quite practically, if I ask this question, will I be able to get people to answer it, or any empirical source to answer it? And what is the analytic technique, and what is the outcome that it will give me? Because it's more than coding, categorizing, theming. Although it's still good science. There is an approach where you code, categorize, and theme, and it's quite good. And I would suggest a lot of master's students would do that, and clinicians as well. It would be called qualitative description. It was pioneered by a nurse researcher, Sandalowski, and that's probably likely what clinicians, all my master's students work in that way, with either in an approach called interpretive description or qualitative description, where you want to stay close to the data and describe the experience. I don't really expect a master's student to go and really embed themselves in 100 years to do a phenomenology. But the cohesion is question, methodology, the pre-stuff, and you talked about epistemology and ontology. It really is, you can start your inquiry with, here's my question, here's my method, this is what I'm going to do. But it really is thinking the foundations prior to that methodology and qualitative inquiry, where what do I believe about reality? So your ontology, what do I believe we can know? What do I believe we can understand? And so that's where that social comes in. Again, measuring as you drop balls off the Leaning Tower of Pisa is a physical science. You can nail that down. Mm-hmm. But in the social, you go, okay, what can we know? What can we realistically know? And will it change tomorrow? Because it's social. So what can we know? So wrapping your head around that. And then how can we know it? How is your epistemology? Do you believe you can stand separate from a parent or a patient and not interact with them and not bring your perspectives to the conversation and stand objectively away from this individual? Or do you believe knowledge is created in a conversation with that individual? Do you believe knowledge is shared and created when you talk to a parent or you talk to a patient, you go, in that help me understand, you create that understanding together, because you'll go, and you'll ask a question. And even the question that you ask is a reflection of where you want to go and where you want to understand something. So you have to bring your subjective experiences together to create this understanding of the phenomenon. So the epistemology is, I always think about it as relationship. Do you feel you can stand separate, objectively, not insert yourself into an inquiry? Or do you feel you sit down with a person and you bring your perspectives together to help understand something? So
how would you define those two different epistemologies? Standing outside or bringing yourself into it? What are those? So what's the definition?
Objectivity and subjectivity. Yeah. So you would kind of go, it gets deeper than that. And we kind of, paradigms used everywhere. So people use it for lots of different things. But we we talk about epistemology, ontology, and then we actually are developing more about paradigms. Are you using a pragmatic paradigm? And so that's usually where mixed methods start. It is a transformative paradigm where it's more of that, we're going to shake everything up and change everything. An interpretive constructivist paradigm. So that kind of gets a little bit more into the weeds about how you label your ontologies and epistemologies. But it really is just generally thinking about, okay, what can we really know and how can we know it? Is it together or do we not interact at all?
And for most qualitative inquiry, I think we interact.
You bet.
Is really important. So then the next step you talked about would be choosing sort of the method, which you talked about grounded theory. I've heard of phenomenology. I've heard of ethnography. What are those three? How do they line up? When should we use them? How would you describe that? Are we missing other methods?
So there's lots of them, and I've just updated, as I mentioned, the book, and I've described 19 different methods. And so ethnography, phenomenology, and grounded theory are kind of like the oldest, the most established, so people kind of start there. And so briefly, ethnography is interested in culture, norms, patterns of behavior. And so you're interested in kind of culture, understanding culture. So a patient support group would have a culture around that experience, right? What is the experience of patient support? So you could look at that culture of patient support or a patient support group. Grounded theory is the process. How do you get through a particular experience? What happened when you were first diagnosed? Then what happened? Then what happened? And how did you come to understand this or be at the place you're at today? Is a grounded theory. Phenomenology is, you'll hear the term lived experience, and lived experience is now in kind of our mainstream discourse of, you want to talk to people that have had that experience, so people use lived experience or living experience. But lived experience really comes from phenomenology, and it really is, it's the pre-reflective. So you can talk to somebody about the grounded theory, how did you get through the process? And people will explain their analysis. They'll put the experience together and say, well, I did this because of this. And then this happened, so we did this. They're sharing with you their analysis of their experience. Phenomenology tries to capture the moment of an experience. And so we don't want to hear in a phenomenology, we don't want to hear, explain that to me, your decision-making process. We want to hear what something felt like in the moment. So there was a student years ago, she was a nurse and she worked in a cardiac unit. And she did a phenomenology on breathing and struggling for breath. So from her clinical, and according to the charts, right, according to this person should be getting up. We have good practice here, but this person should be getting up. Let's try and walk them a few steps. Let's try and walk them to the washroom. And so from her clinical experience, she would ask her patient, are you doing okay? And the patient would say, yes, I'm okay. But she would say, but you're breathing, like, tell me about your breathing, right? Like, are you okay? And she always felt a discomfort in her practice with that. There was always something she was feeling really uncomfortable with. And so she did a phenomenology on that experience of struggling to breathe. What does that feel like when you're struggling? And what happened? Help me understand what that must be like for you. And what an incredible clinical learning. Mm-hmm. Because you might have I've never had asthma. I've never had a hard time struggling. I guess I've never pushed myself physically running or something where I've never struggled that with that. But through a good phenomenology, you go, oh my God, that's what it must feel like to struggle for a breath. How terrifying, how awful. And so phenomenology might seem really detached from an applied discipline, but it really can help you understand what this experience is like for this person. And can make you a better teacher, clinician, social worker, or whatever you're, in an applied discipline. So those are kind of the three biggies.
So can I do a little experiment here? So what you described too was sort of the humanness of it. So rather than saying like, what was your scale of dyspnea on when you got out of your bed, right? It's like, what is it like for you? I reviewed a grant once. It was probably the best grant I've ever read. I'll try to put this into 3 different methods. It was about receiving a heart transplant. And so the grounded theory might be, let's say you're a young person, right? And you're in heart failure. And now you have to wait. And you're waiting for a new heart. And this whole process is just unbelievably stressful. And you don't know, you're waiting for, and it's complex. You're waiting for someone to die. And so the grounded theory would then explain the process of waiting, maybe receiving the news, going through the surgery, and then your whole theory would be developed from that person's experience. The phenomenology would be, and I think this is where the grant was, what is it like for you to meet the family member? And what is it like for that family member to meet you when they know that heart,
giving me goosebumps,
that the heart of their loved one is beating in your chest? And I was blown away. Like I did not want to stop reading that. And then the third one would be for a culture, and I work a lot with First Nation communities. So there's intimate spiritual connection with your body. What is the cultural phenomenon of having a transplant in the First Nation context for me as a non-First Nations person? What would that mean for me? And I shouldn't even say First Nations. I should say Cree or Ojibwe, Dene, like based on this cultural experience. So is that a good way to say sort of the same question maybe, but we can answer it 3 different ways? And
you
then
bet
choose.
is great. 100%, John, 100% on that one.
I still get goosebumps when I think about that project. So what are some of the other methods though? You talked about 19 other ones. What should we be thinking of, or trainees should be looking, what's new and exciting?
Yeah. You know what I thought you were going to say about the waiting was the phenomenology could also be, what is it like to wait? What is that experience of waiting, right? Mm-hmm. But at that moment of meeting, goosebumps. And I get goosebumps all the time when what excites me about qualitative inquiry is what it can tell us about the human condition, right? Like about our complexity, right? And there's so much good qualitative stuff out there that does give you shivers and does give you, and because you go, oh my God, that's it.
Maybe that's the p-value.
That's the p-value. Right? It is.
What was the shiver index or whatever?
Yeah, exactly. we can hook you up to something and get your shiver level. Okay, let me think. Well, there's been, of course, so ethnography, for example, was like 100 years ago and kind of started with Margaret Mead, right? Like that kind of, you got on a plane and you flew somewhere to look at this exotic culture to help you understand. And so now we understand now culture is kind of everywhere. There's a culture of being a medical student, right? That's a culture. It's a cultural experience coming in, and how do you behave and what do you say and what do you not say, and when do you get up and when do you go to bed, and what's considered being a good physician, what's considered being not a good physician, how do you gain credibility in that culture? How do you lose credibility? Like all of those things. So we understand culture can be everywhere. Because of these kind of main methods have been around for a long time, there's splinters, right? There's kind of, but we could take these ideas of, for example, culture and use it. And I'll bring up a very controversial one, but I love it. The method is called autoethnography. It's writing your own experience. And people go, oh my God, how narcissistic. Please put me out of my misery. Don't be sitting there writing about yourself. But what makes it research or inquiry is that you take your personal experience, or maybe there's 2 of you, duoethnography, and you write about it, but you also link it to the literature. You link it to what we understand about this experience. So instead of interviewing 20 participants, it's you and your colleague or just yourself, and you write about a particular experience, linking it, embedding it in the literature so that it contributes to knowledge. And so, so some people really forget this, this is not science. But when I look at, like, one of my favorite autoethnographies is written by a guy named Tony Adams. Tony wrote about, he grew up in the States in a very conservative family in a very conservative town, and he's gay. And so he talks about his experience of coming out as an adult and how he goes back home and his dad takes him to Hooters because, like, let's go for lunch, takes him to a bar and how when he goes home, there's always this kind of like, maybe that was just kind of a blip in your life, or, oh, maybe this really isn't real, and the aunts and uncles and all this conversation. So he calls it coming out complications, right? And how family has heard that he's gay, but it's just never really accepted. And so this really tension relationship with his family, and he embeds it in the literature. And so in a class I've taught, and we go through autoethnography, you tell your family something and they just don't want to believe it. And so this one student said, and again, the concept of generalizability I know is fraught, but this one student said, oh my God, that's exactly the experience I have being a vegetarian. She grew up on a farm, of course, right? Yeah. And she's vegan, actually. She's vegan. She won't eat butter. And she goes, I tell my family and they think this is wrong. They don't accept my lifestyle. And every time I go home, of course, it's usually during Christmas and Thanksgiving, they put a turkey in front of me and say, here. And it's that constant negotiation of no mom, no dad, different in generalization, as hers is considered a choice and his wouldn't be, but that generalizability. So what you can learn about, not only if that's your experience of coming out, and you go, yeah, that's exactly what happened to me, or mine was a little bit, it can be put into different experiences. When your experience is not accepted by family and friends, and that constantness of coming up against that wall all the time. So autoethnography, right?
Right.
So that took a long time.
That's a good one. So that is a nice segue maybe to talk about sampling. So in an autoethnography, having that lived experience and then sharing it and then realizing later that it's generalizable is great, right? But I always hear people talk about, we purposely sampled. Yeah. And then when I read the grant or I read the paper, I'm like, you didn't really purposely sample, or they just say it and then they don't say what purpose, like what was the purpose. So what is purposely sampling? How do you choose your sample? And then again, with the methodological coherence, it should line up, I guess, with grounded theory or phenomenology. So maybe can you explain what sampling looks like?
Yeah, purposeful sampling, you're right, people just will throw it in. It really is choosing people that can speak to your question, can speak to the phenomenon. So you are looking for people that are the best example, or who can speak the best to that phenomenon. So you're not controlling for, well, sometimes you might go, if it's too broad, you might say parents choosing whether or not to have a transplant for their kid. That's pretty big. Like that's a pretty big question. You might, because of your clinical experience, you might say heart transplant is quite a unique experience versus other transplants. I'm going to narrow it to heart transplant. And you might go, I want to narrow it because I think culture, like ethnicity, might play a huge role in that, or religious perspective might play a huge role in that. So I'm going to narrow it a little bit to, so I don't know this area, but maybe Jehovah's Witness. I might, because I know if I just say parents' experience with transplant, choosing a transplant, that might be way, way, way too big. Way, way, way too big. We might just get too much diverse data that we'll never be able to saturate, right? Because then you'll hear something from maybe a person from a particular faith and you'll go, oh, those are way too different. I'm not going to be able to say anything about that because it's just too diverse. You'll have to bound your study in some way based on your experience, based on the literature. Okay, I'm going to do this study.
Can you just say, you said saturate, and just for the listener, saturation means what?
Saturation means you're pretty confident at the end of it. You can stand up and say, I think this is part of the phenomenon. Okay. Like enough people spoke to this category, to this theme. I believe that it truly is part of the experience. Kind of not a knockoff, not kind of a like, it is part of the experience. I believe that this is a part of the experience. So generally people say it's because enough people referred to that. But then it gets us into the counting issue, but it is part of the phenomenon. You can say, yes, this category has been saturated. It's real. It exists.
Does it line up with phenomenology and ethnography? And in your book, I kind of interpreted that maybe there are some numbers, although I don't want to go down this path, but you know, like someone would say, oh, we had 12. So that for sure, that's a lot, right?
Yeah. There's a great editorial that says qualitative researchers don't count. Again, okay, if you're a student or your funder or somebody, like, let's be really practical. If they want you to say how many out of the 15 participants said this, okay, I'll go with that if that's really important. But the analytic work, so I had a student who studied, it was a physiotherapist and understudied the clinician patient interaction. And in her data, a physiotherapist said, sometimes you got to bleed for your participant. Sometimes you got to bleed. Not everybody said sometimes you got to bleed. You didn't count that.
Right.
But it was such an important part of the experience because it really got to sometimes you got to just give. You got to give of your entire being when this person who has pelvic floor issues has been sexually assaulted and you're like whatever. So sometimes you got to give. So you don't count that. But oh boy, was it a part of the phenomenon. People said it in different ways. People indicated it in different ways. Participants did. So that's the counting. That's the counting issue that you can get into trouble with.
You know what? Actually, you just transitioned into a beautiful question that I think is maybe one of the most important things, because people ask me this all the time, is how do you actually analyze your data? So we'll go back into different methods for actually collecting the data. But you just talked about, let's say you interview 10 people or 15 people. Your sample lines up with your method. People who are new will often say to me, we'll just buy in vivo, and in vivo will count the number of words, and that's it, right? Like a theme is like, well, they said this 65 times. But what you just said was, no, someone had this beautiful quote. And we have a quote from a parent advisory committee for work we're doing on the built environment that I think is going to stay with me forever when we talk about the health of their neighborhood. And they said, it's easier to be a murder victim in my neighborhood than it is to try to be healthy. And I was like, whoa, that's a theme. That's a theme.
Chills again. Right? You got a good one.
That's a theme for me. But for you, the analysis process, it's really complex. I think you need to do it the right way, right? What are some of the boundaries or some of the things that trainees need to know about analyzing their data? It's not counting words.
So, okay, so this is the pet peeve. This is when people say, give me your coding framework. So coding means, okay, you went through the first swath of your data and you coded something. Maybe you read that, what you just said, John, about it's easier to be a murder victim. Maybe you coded that as violence. You code. And then that first swath of data, you have codes, violence, fear, I don't know. But then you read some more data and that violence turns into fear, a code of fear. So this whole idea of like a code book, when people say, give me your code book, I say, which version? Do you want the version of like the first 2 interviews or how it's evolved? And so I guess for analysis, one of your biggest rules of analysis is collect some data, analyze the data. Collect some data, analyze the data. It's this concurrent process, because if you go in, have some interview questions, blast through 20 people, and dang, in interview number 3, they said it's easier to be a murder victim than it is to be healthy. And you missed that and you didn't follow up on that. So you missed the opportunity to find something really unique about this phenomenon, about your question, and you didn't follow it up. You weren't that detective, listening to what people were telling you and then testing it out, trying it out. How do people understand that? And so if you just go in and blast in and just collect data, you are going to miss those gems that really do tell you something different about this experience, about this phenomenon that we haven't understood before, or we haven't understood in depth before. So you have to do that, collect data, analyze, collect data in a concurrent fashion. And I would say that was probably a rule among all of those methods, except if you're doing a very large, probably mixed method study, you do a survey, and then you're going to go interview after, and you're going to do 100 people. So that would be the only time that concurrent wouldn't be the rule.
Right.
But concurrent data collection analysis, and then each analytic technique has their own way of doing things. So if you need a theory from grounded theory, if you're going to get at a theory, it's called constant comparison. But you compare people against people, participants, incidences about incidents. So in a theory, for example, we have, okay, what happened before that? What happened after that? Was that before and after the same for these people? If it wasn't, was there before and after? So, okay, what happened before that incident happened? What happened after? How does it diverge? So, incidents You compare people's experiences, their incidents, the outcomes. Are their outcomes the same? This constant comparison is taking basically anything you can compare in that data set and comparing them against each other to build that theory of concepts and how they're interrelated. So that would be, for example, like a grounded theory, whereas phenomenology, it's that interviewing for phenomenology is super tough because you don't want that analysis. I did this because you want that. Tell me what it felt like to wait, what it felt like to struggle for breath, what it felt like to, there was a great one, a teacher did one on making eye contact with a student. When you get to that student and you've made that eye contact and you see them smile or you see them light up, right? That eye contact, what's that moment like? So that interviewing is very difficult because people don't speak like that. And so in a particular, like there's a bazillion phenomenologies. In this phenomenology, it's you look at how does that feel in the body? How do you contextualize that in time and space? So you kind of have a frame of called existentials. So that's a phenomenology. You don't code and categorize in a phenomenology. You look at these kind of the body, time, space, experience. So it's, if you're going to choose a particular approach, make sure you know the analytic technique associated with it.
Another thing I took from your book is that it's not always just the quotes or the themes, or there could be, and I think we're going to have to do a second one because we've only touched on so many things. So are you okay with if we like?
Of course.
Okay, but
yeah, of course I know.
It could be, you're talking to some of my colleagues, like the body language when interviewing. If it's arts-based, it could be the depiction of art. It could be videos. So the data itself, we haven't even talked about document analysis. For another project we're thinking about, like what is the response to reading a document analysis where you know that your group has not been acknowledged in that document?
Good one. Good one.
Yeah, the families who work with us, we're going to have them read these active transportation city plans, right? And the plan at the outset says AAA, it has to be all ages and abilities. But I don't see myself on those trails. I don't see myself in this city, in this neighborhood. And you didn't even acknowledge me in your development of your plan, right? So what's that experience like for that individual who's reading that with you? So if you're okay, we can pause here. We'll do another one and then come back to when do I choose a focus group versus an individual interview. I also want to talk about triangulating data, if you're okay with that, and then go a little deeper onto different analytical techniques and then your pet peeves. I love that you said as a qualitative inquirist, you are an explorer, right? You're going down paths, rivers that no one's ever explored before. And so there's something really exciting about that, right?
There is. Yeah.
And then sort of that objectivity, right? If you are an explorer, how can you just stay objective?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And then reflexivity, and I don't know what that means. I hear it all the time.
Oh, yeah, it's a big deal.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you're okay.
Yep. Part 2.
Okay.
Great.
This was awesome. Thank you so much.
Have a good rest of the day.
Yeah, you too. Take care.
Thanks, John.
Bye.
Okay, bye.
That was part 1 of our conversation with Dr. Maria Mayan on qualitative methods. Be sure to join us on part 2 of this discussion in episode 12, where Dr. Mayan provides more insightful guidance on integrating qualitative techniques and methodological coherence into qualitative research questions and research studies. Thanks for listening. The Emerging Scholar Podcast was recorded in the UMFM studios located at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. This is Treaty 1 territory, the original homeland of the Anishinaabe, the Innu, and on the national homeland of the Red River Métis. Manitoba is also homeland to the Anishinaabe, the Dakota Ayote, and the Dene peoples. We acknowledge that our water is sourced from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. As a settler scientist working in health research, I acknowledge TRC call to action number 18, that health inequities between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people are the direct result of colonization. Winnipeg is the center for reconciliation in Canada, and where we are speaking from today is at the crossroads of Canada's history and Canada's future. We are 3 kilometers away from one of the most sacred meeting grounds for Indigenous people on the plains and within Turtle Island. We are also several kilometers away from one of the last residential schools in the province. We are working collectively on reconciliation action with youth, elders, and community leaders to heal from the trauma of colonization, past and present, honor the original treaties, and create a Canada that addresses and eliminates the inequities and injustices of the past and present to create a future for Indigenous children to live and thrive. On behalf of the team at the Emerging Scholar podcast, we want to thank Osani Balkaran for the great production for our opening and closing themes. We also want to thank UMFM 101.5, especially co-producer Jared Makitiak for technical assistance and production on this project. We also want to thank all of our guests for the discussion and the insight that they've provided. Once again, thank you for listening. Be sure to subscribe to the Emerging Scholar podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and umfm.com.